Welcome today, folks. Today we have a guest that I am super excited to have the opportunity to talk to. We have Mr. Tony Porter. He is an author, educator, and activist working to advance social justice issues. As the chief executive officer of A Call to Men, Tony is internationally recognized for his efforts to prevent violence against women while promoting a healthy, respectful manhood. He is a leading voice on issues of manhood, male socialization, and its intersection with violence and preventing violence against all women and girls. Tony's 2010 TED Talk was named by GQ magazine as one of the top 10 TED Talks every man should see. And I wholeheartedly agree. Welcome today, Tony. How are you?
I'm good, my brother. I appreciate you having me.
Well, I really, truly, as I said before, feel that it's an honor and a pleasure to have you here, especially in this day and age with so much that's going on with violence, with a particular focus on violence against our young girls and our women. Can you talk a little bit about the work that you do at A Call to Men?
Yeah, and you're spot on. We know that violence against women and girls is at epidemic proportions, one of the leading causes of injury to women in our country. Center for Disease Control has said that. They've taken it on as a health issue. They put it right alongside of cancer and heart disease, the number one and two causes of death for women. So it's truly at epidemic proportions. But our work at A Call to Men, we don't focus so much on men who perpetrate the violence, which is a minority of men in comparison to the rest of us. There's a lot of men, but it's a minority of men when you compare them to the rest of us. And again, it's a tremendous amount of violence. So we more so from a standpoint of prevention. So of course, with men who perpetrate violence, we need to continue to respond to that. But from a standpoint of prevention, obviously we want to stop the violence before it happens. And we believe that in order to do that, we really have to focus our attention on this majority of men that don't perpetrate the violence. Like, what is it in the socialization of manhood that allows an epidemic of violence against women and girls to happen in the presence of all of us men who would not do such, right? It would be similar if we was talking about white supremacy culture. What is it about white supremacy culture, right, that allows the violence that is perpetrated against black and brown folks by a minority of folks, of white folks? But what is it about the culture of white supremacy that allows that to happen? All right, so that's how we do our work. And we couch it in the promotion of healthy, respectful manhood. We have this thing we coin called the man box, which is all the collective socialization of what it means to be a man. We use a box as a visual. It works with boys, particularly and young men. Really, to unpack male socialization at the end of the day is about unpacking male socialization, what allows this epidemic of violence to happen on our watch, in our presence. What is it about us as men that in many respects create the fertile ground for men who are abusive to do this on our watch, in our presence? And so then what would it take for us to address it, challenge it, end it? And if we don't end it, we need to at least put a big old dent in it.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah. You talk about the man box. Can you give us an example of what it looks like to begin? Number one, to understand what the man box is and how we go about unpacking it.
Yeah. So again, it's just a catchy phrase, a visual that helps men really quickly get around a conversation. What we're actually talking about is what we call, at A Call to Men, the collective socialization of manhood. We use a box to frame a conversation around. When we talk about the collective socialization of manhood, what we do is really begin to explore many of the common themes, the common messages, the teaching of what it means to be a man. And so much of that teaching is defined simply by defining what it means to be a man by distancing ourselves from our perceived experience of what it means to be a woman, right? Men are supposed to be tough, strong, athletic, aggressive, dominating, in control, not vulnerable, show no feelings with the exception of anger, right? Hold it down, make it happen, protect her, and I'm not saying everything in the man box is bad, but we do put a particular emphasis on how the man box also teaches us in respect to defining manhood by distance ourselves from the experience of women and girls. It teaches us to have less value in women and girls. Teaches us to view women and girls far too often as objects, particularly sexual objects, and then how all of that plays out in supporting an environment of violence against women and girls. The man box teaches us as men, again, never to express feelings and emotions with the exception of anger. It doesn't teach us that anger is actually a secondary emotion, which is fear and pain, is what we actually initially felt. But in essence, though, it still teaches us not to respond to fear, not to own up to fear, never speak about when you're scared, and never talk about being in pain, whether it's physical pain or emotional pain. It teaches us don't ask for help, don't offer help, don't accept help, right? So all these characteristics of manhood, items in the man box, not only are they supporting an epidemic of violence against women and girls, they're killing us as men too, right? So this whole idea of defining manhood by distancing ourselves from the experience of women and girls, what it requires, and it starts out as a boy, what it requires is that we have a lack of interest in the experience of, so let's say boys are taught, is a very heteronormative, heterosexist, binary experience, by the way. And it teaches boys not to have an interest in the experience of girls at all early on, and then it lends way towards sexual conquest would be one of the places they can start demonstrating interest without their manhood being challenged at the end of the day. And so we're taught to have less value because you can't value something you're taught to not be interested in, right? And you talk to an average group of men, and I would say men who have experienced college, most of whether women's studies courses were available or not, let's say they were available, most men will say they had no interest in taking them. And then you take those 10% of men in a women's studies course, like 3 men, 30 students, and you ask them, what do your friends think about you being in the class? And they will tell you, well, the only thing that made sense to them is that either I was gay or I was there to meet women. Well, let's say I'm not gay, and that's a whole nother conversation, but let's say I'm not gay, and let's say I'm not there to meet women, I'm there to learn about the experience of women. That's difficult for men to get around, because it's outside of what we've been taught. So that's a big part of what we spend a lot of our time. We know we're the first generation of men being asked to have these conversations. So we spend a lot of time breaking this thing down and then encouraging and helping men to gain the courage to really add their voice and their experiences, their influence, their platform to be part of this social change.
Yeah, yeah. And a word, first of all, I applaud you for the work. And a word that I heard in there was providing men the courage to step into these spaces. Because for myself, what I'm seeing is there can be a lot of blowback when a majority of males hear something around this conversation and they feel attacked. They feel like their manhood or the essence of being male is under attack. And
Mm-hmm.
just being a man is something that's bad or something that's, labeled as bad. How do you go about addressing that?
Yeah, that's a great question. Uh, we believe our work is much more in art versus science, right? We believe in science. We believe in research, particularly in a country that's dedicated to counting and measuring. So we gotta do academia in its place. But our work when we're engaging men is what we call a transformational experience. You hear us talk about reaching in and grabbing the hearts of men. ensure they leave our presence thinking and feeling differently than they did when they entered. And understanding and respecting that there's a lot of distance between the head and the heart, to get to it at times. Uh, we have loving experiences with men. You'll hear us also say we're inviting men, not indicting men. You rarely, if ever, hear us talk about good guys and bad guys. We don't do that. You'll also hear us being very transparent ourselves. We want you to be vulnerable. We have to be vulnerable in your presence. And in that transparency that you will experience from us, we'll talk about our faults and our inconsistencies in trying to reach, this self-actualization point that we're talking about. You'll hear us talk about the man box and being in the box and then being outside the box is what we're trying to achieve. But you'll also hear us say, there are times we're in the box and times we're out of the box. So when we're in the presence of other men, we're real clear there's no big eyes, little U's. We're just having a conversation amongst men, seeking a goal of how we can do better, right? And the way we approach this with men, we often have success in men being able to sit back, open up their hearts, open up their ears, and be in the conversation because we do it in a very non-threatening way. And when I say it's an art versus science, many folks can't kind of get around that you can have a loving uh, and accountable experience simultaneously, right? So it's a very loving experience, very kind experience, and a very accountable experience at the same time. It is an art versus science. Everyone cannot be in a call to men trainer. We're not wedded to a deck of slides. We're not wedded to a podium. When we're in a setting, if we're not in a circle, if we're in a lecture hall, we're up and down the aisles, getting close to men, talking to men, removing the distance between us. So is a lot that we do to really tackle the defensiveness that would make sense would be in the space.
Yeah. What I hear and resonate with is that invitation to move into the heart space, get out of the head and get into the heart.
Hmm. Yeah. See, transformation we believe happens in our hearts, not in our heads. We're not discounting the knowledge, but we're not seeking an academic experience with men. We're seeking a transformational experience with men, and we really try to fully utilize whatever time that they're going to be in our presence to start that process. So I might only have him for 20 minutes, but I want him thinking about me when he leaves and everything that we talked about.
Yeah.
Because it will immediately, because that's how this deal is, no matter what form of group oppression we're talking about, and here we're talking about sexism, he will immediately, when he leaves our presence, it won't take long, should I simply say, before he'll have examples of what we just talked about. And those examples were always there, but what we're also trying to do is really challenge his cultural lenses, right? How he sees things, right? So it was the same stuff he was seeing before he came in our presence, but now when he's seeing it, we made a little adjustment to his cultural lenses, and we're hoping that he immediately starts having some aha moments, and then hopefully get on the journey with us.
Yeah. Yeah. So I guess so. The next thing that I would ask is what brought you to this journey for yourself personally?
Yeah. I was a social worker in New York. I was a director of addiction services at a hospital town called Nyack, New York, about 30 miles north of the Bronx. Uh, and it's a town uh, like most communities have a domestic violence, sexual assault services, but also in this town they had a very pro-feminist atmosphere. So the women were very much approaching these issues in all places, right? All places. And so they would come to my program and speak to the women about the services that were available. They would speak to the men, talking about the patients, the clients, about domestic violence and what it looks like and how it shows up. And at that time, I was doing a lot of anti-racism work. I'm still very much involved in it. And we were looking at that point, a lot of my anti-racism work was focused on the field I was in, which was addiction, and really looking at the prison industrial complex, who's in jail and why. Because, and at that time, we were really dealing a lot with repealing the Rockefeller drug laws, with these crazy, crazy sentences that people were getting for small amount of drugs. And so we were really paying a lot of attention to concentrated poverty, the communities where you can go and buy drugs at 3 o'clock in the morning without an appointment. You know, who would come in and out of the community, the cop and run back to the suburbs, but then who was held hostile, who was held responsible for this here, and how all of that was playing out. Really, really doing a lot of work around a race construct, but with a lot of focus on addiction, drugs, legal drugs as well as illegal drugs, and how we as a nation was absorbed with that. So just by virtue of doing that work, which is a form of social justice work, it put me in a space of women who were really looking at sexism, right? We're looking at male domination. And they began to engage me. You know, I didn't know a lot about it. You know, I didn't know, like today we talk about the intersections of group oppression. Our sister Kimberly Crenshaw coined a term called intersectionality, how race, sex, class, age, ableism, or abilities, how all of that intersects. And the more forms of oppression that you're experiencing, person of color, woman, financially poor, right? Uh, Part of the LGBTQ, trans, GNC community, differing abilities, the more of those, we call those forms of marginalization, the more you experience, the deeper the oppression you're going to experience here in the United States, which we also call a race construct at the end of the day. Uh, so if I'm in a space doing work around undoing racism, I'm going to find folks in that space doing work around undoing sexism. You're going to be connected up and running into folks doing work challenging heterosexism. You'll all find yourselves together. Uh, and women started just saying, Tony, you're doing great work on the undoing racism, man. What about your sexism, brother? And initially, I was like offended, because I'm like, hey, look, I'm trying to do my best over here, and y'all trying to find something to pull me down. It wasn't that at all. They seen something in me. They knew it was time to really start doing prevention work. Women had been responding to the violence for a long time, right? Forever in this country. But the particular feminist wave that we were in the midst of came out in the 70s on the heels of the civil rights movement. And we're talking now in the 1990s, so maybe 20 years later. So laws are being passed or laws are being enforced, right? New laws and created laws being enforced, pushing the envelope on education and community involvement. Women are making all these things happen. Uh, Correct services for those who've been victimized and putting the monies in there to take care of them. All of this is happening, but the violence is not declining at all. So we're responding to it better, which is important, but it's not declining. And so in their wisdom, they knew that if we was going to prevent the violence, which is the end goal, men are going to have to be part of the solution. So they started investing in me, uh, and they start teaching me. And I became attracted to it, man. What they were asking of me as part of a dominating group, being a man, to address violence against women and girls is what I've been asking white folks to do forever. right? And particularly white men. It's rare that you hear white man really break racism down. Like he'll tell you it's bad and we shouldn't do it. But it's rare that you'll hear a white man really talk about all the experience he's had, what he's witnessed, how he's seen stuff go down, you know, what he's been a part of, whether just as, you know, someone who's just silent in the room, not saying that he was participating, but it's rare for a white man to really, really let it go. He could chill a room out if he really, really talked from his heart, from the time he was a boy, the things that he heard said, the things that he took part in. White men don't do that, right? White women to give you a little of that, they don't get but so deep either. But this was an opportunity for me as a man to now I step into the space as a black man. So, you know, I don't go but so far. And I bring to that space the experiences of black men, because while we perpetrate sexism, racism is kicking our butts. And there are some correlations there that need to be owned and we need to be honest about. But nevertheless, the work became attractive, to me, and I got on board. I know most folks, when I talk about what I do and when I started doing it, which is, you know, almost a generation ago, close to 30 years ago, folks, they either think that something happened to me, or maybe I was a abuser, or maybe I was abused as a child, or maybe my mother was abused, and my mother was abused, sexually assaulted by my grandfather when she was a child, but I didn't know that till I was well into work. I think she only told me because of what I was doing in my life at the time. So, because that comes back to what I was talking about earlier, this whole thing about interest, right? It's hard for folks to believe, at least back then, that I would be interested in this without having connected with it personally somewhere. Now, I became interested in it because I was interested in ending group oppression. And this was an opportunity where I thought I could have a huge impact. But it all was built around women's leadership and women encouraging me. I had a lot of mentors back in the day, and some of them are still in my life today, 30 years later.
Yeah. Could you speak a little bit about, because I heard you mention the intersection between sexism and racism. Could you expound on that a little bit for our listeners who might not be aware of some of
Right.
those connections?
Yeah. So we look at several forms of what we call group oppression, right? So in the United States of America, we believe is a race construct, right? Is in its origin is control, legitimate control and access over resources. And based on what groups you belong to, you will see that access more readily available. So when we look at group oppression, we look at white men, white men are dominating, people of color are marginalized, and you see racism. Uh, Let me just say white people are dominating, people of color marginalized, racism. Men dominating, women marginalized, sexism, right? Uh, Classism, wealthy, upper middle class folks, right? That's where you're looking at classism versus financially poor people. Able-bodied folks, here we're talking about people with disability versus people with disabilities, and that's called ableism. There's also ageism, right? Middle age is dominating in our society, and younger and older people are marginalized, right? That's called ageism. Even from religion, years ago we used to say Christian, Jews, anti-Semitism. That's not really what the seat of power. That was that was a setup, a dupe job to get us to believe that Jews ran everything. That was a dupe job. What's really true that we believe, if we're going to talk about religion in space to domination, is Protestant. is Christianity, but it's the denomination Protestant, right? White Anglo-Saxon Protestant is the dominating religious group in our country. And then there's everybody else, right? So white, male, and then there's also the piece around heterosexism, right? Uh, Whether you identify as heterosexual versus lesbian, gay, trans, bisexual, right? Gender non-conforming. So you got all your dominating groups and you got your marginalized groups. So let's take a woman who's black, financially poor, and identifies as queer, right? Those are four marginalized groups that she's a member of, right? And each one of them are impacting in her life. Just being a woman will have a certain level of impact, right? But when you say a woman who's a woman of color, or a black woman, or financially poor woman, or black financially poor woman with a disability, right? You can when you envision her, you can easily see many forms of group oppression, and you can also envision what her life might be like. So I want you to think about a 65-year-old black financially poor woman that uses a wheelchair. You can just see her life. And that's the impact of multiple forms of group oppression in her life, right? Where you can have, from the dominating column, you can have a white, wealthy man, right? Uh, who uses a wheelchair, and that's just a man in a wheelchair. There's nothing else, ain't nothing else happening in his life holding him back, right? So when you look at group oppression, and we talk about the intersections of group oppression, uh, which mostly is, in many respects, is looking at multiple forms of marginalization in a person's life and how that then shows up. It's also a good tool, though, for like me as a black man. I can look at being dominating as a man and being marginalized as being black, and that gives me a leg up maybe on a white dude in respect that I understand oppression, right? So maybe because I do understand oppression as it relates to race, so if you teach me about intersections of oppression, I would be able to easily understand, because I know what oppression feels like. So then in this space where I'm now realizing I'm dominating, I know what it would mean then for me to do better, right? When you find yourself going back and forth. So yeah, that's what we're talking about when we're talking about the intersections.
Yeah. Yeah. And folks, I hope you're really paying attention, because this is higher education that we're engaging in here today. So what I'm going to ask you next, Tony, is because I heard you when you were working in the spaces in Nyack, New York, in anti-racism workshops, etc., and then you had the strong women around you who were like, brother, there's some things you need to look at. When they held that mirror up for you, after you got over, or while you were going through the, you're just trying to hold me down, I'm over here trying to do something, now get up off my back. What was it like for you to look in that mirror and see where you were perpetuating dominance over someone?
Oh yeah, man. It not only was it eye opening, I still look in that mirror today. There's no graduation. There's no graduation. There's no certificate of completion. It's a journey, and your goal is to stay on the journey. The goal is to know when I'm causing harm or doing something inappropriate, and stopping it, fixing it, and putting time and distance between the next time that happens, right? It's about what we call at A Call to Men, getting off of remote control, right? Because as men, we're socialized just to do tradition. What it is that we've always done is passed down to us, and we just do tradition. And so we're kind of on remote control. We're not thinking negative thoughts all the time. Like, I was an avid athlete, right? I can't tell you on the air, in a game of basketball, I'd be horribly ashamed to say some of the names that I would use for other men who wasn't holding it down. I was that kind of basketball player that completely different from today's game, because today's game is a lot of transition up and down the court, right? When I was playing basketball, it was a half court game, where we're playing a full court, but you would actually wait for the center to get up, you know, up on his side of the court, get his position, and then we move. And the ball goes into him, out from him, into him, out. And now, you know, you can't be a Shaq type center no more. That's gone. That left with Shaq. He too slow. That left with him. Now everything is running and gunning. But we used to play a game that by setting the game up like that, the whole game is played in the paint. Just about the whole game is playing in the paint. And it's dirty and rough in there. And I love that. I loved it. And I can't tell you, man, the thoughts I would have in my head and things I would say, street ball to other men, and everything that I would call a man were derogatory, disrespectful, and maybe even dehumanizing names that we would have for women and girls. See, the whole thing that was going on was to tell a man he's not up to standards is to put him in that place of less value that we already taught that women and girls belong, right? Coached a lot of sports. I was better at coaching sports as long as I was coaching kids because I knew how to talk to kids. But if I was coaching a group of men, same names. Stop playing like this. Stop playing like that. Go ahead and do what you're supposed to do like this. It's like for us as men, we have this place of higher understanding, expectations, right? And then there's this place of lower and less value. And so we work with coaches a lot. We work in sports more than any other arena. And so one of the questions, a coach would tell a boy to stop playing like a girl because he's up here, and to tell him he's playing like a girl is telling him he's now down here. And keeping in mind, the boy is taught throughout his life to define what it means to be a man by distancing himself from the experience of girl. Remember, we're back there again. The coach just put him right alongside girls, right? So what does he do? He bucks up, tries harder to get back up here. So coaches use that language as a means of motivation, but without thinking about the fact that, well, every time you tell a boy to stop playing like a girl, what are you saying about girls? And by the way, we don't say stop playing like a girl because that's too soft. So we got to say it harder
Yeah.
because you don't want to appear soft. So to say it harder, in essence, is to use language that's even more denigrating and dehumanizing to women and girls. So we use this language to motivate ourselves because we're taught to distance ourselves from women and girls and not wanting to be in this place of less value and the whole idea of being weak and soft and all of that. I was a big part of that as a young man. I grew up in the inner city. Uh, Parents did well by me, but I spent a lot of time running and gunning in the streets. The military in some respects saved me because I went into the army when I was 17. Back then, you can go in, can't do that today, but you can go in back then at 17. And that kind of like, I don't know, redirected the course of my life in many respects. Not kind of like it did. I'm not promoting military. I got issues with militarism and a lot of that stuff, but that was my journey. So coming into this work, uh, yeah, I learned a lot about myself, and because we do the work in a very transparent way, learned early on to talk about myself in order for other men to talk about themselves as well. Uh, but yeah, and it's not like a simple go to social work school and do this work. This kind of work, if you're a man, if you're a male identified person, You got to give up yourself to get it. You got to get on your own journey to really get it, to bring other men along.
Yeah, yeah. And you just said a lot there. And what really stuck out for me that I would hope that our listeners take away is a very key word, and that was dehumanizing. And when I'm out there on the court and I'm out there on the field and I use certain derogatory language towards one of my peers to make them feel less than and to devalue who they are and how they're showing up out here on the quote unquote field of battle, what I am doing is dehumanizing an entire class of people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And to flip that the other way around, and this is sometimes hard for men to grapple with. I would not say it in the beginning of our conversation, might not have said it all. You just brought it up for me. But I think as we're near and closer to the end, and we've been talking for a minute, maybe some of the men can grab a hold of it. We believe that defining manhood by distancing ourselves from the experience of girls, women, girls later become women, boys later become men. We believe, and creating this robotic experience for us. We believe that in some respects, we're distancing ourselves from our own humanity. See, we believe with all the violence and experience that women and girls have, they are still a lot closer to humanity, right? They don't have uh, this box that we're talking about. I mean, they got stuff, but the rigid notions of manhood that we're required to adhere to is different from their experience. This rigidity, this robotic experience of what it means to be a man, like I was saying, no feelings. We have very limited emotional intelligence as men because we don't get to explore our feelings. You talk the average 16-year-old boy, he's looking a little twisted up. You say, John, what's wrong? He's going to immediately say, nothing, I'm good, right? Because he's been taught since he's a little boy not to accept help, ask for help. Suicide rates amongst men is 3.5 times higher than women. We don't practice preventative medicine because that's a form of asking help, and we're taught that asking help is a sign of weakness. Even when we go to the doctor, 40% of us don't tell the doctor. We're at the doctor's office and still not telling him 100% what's wrong, still minimizing it, right? We believe that being taught to define manhood by distancing ourselves from the experience of women and girls, in many respects, equates with distancing ourselves from our own humanity. So when we talk about promoting healthy, when we talk about ending violence against women and girls, we're also talking about promoting healthy, respectful manhood. Uh, you'll hear us say, the more we increase healthy, respectful manhood, just doing that alone, we decrease violence against women and girls without ever even talking about it. But we believe that this rigid socialization of what we define as being a man, and there's one other thing that I didn't mention here, is just an operative word in our work, is authenticity. This These rigid notions of manhood really stops it makes it very difficult for boys later to be men to be their authentic selves, right? You have to conform, right? It's very, you got to be on, you got to show up in a certain way. You cannot be your authentic self without falling victim uh, to this man box. And so you're robbed of your authenticity. And when you're robbed of your authenticity, you're robbed of your humanity. They go hand in hand in many respects. So that whole dehumanization of women, that's part of the deal. And our own humanity, we have to give that up for part of the deal as well.
Hmm. So there you go, folks. Straight out of the mouth of Tony Porter from A Call to Men.
Yes,
Is
sir.
there anything that we have not touched on today that you'd like to leave our listeners with?
I would like to I think the last thing I would say to men, to male identified folks, the large majority of us are loving men, kind men, want to do the right thing, just trying to hold it down men, right? That's the majority of us. But I would ask us to really begin to ask the question, how is it that we have an epidemic of violence against women in the United States of America? 1 out of 4 women will be assaulted in her lifetime. Sexual violence, 1 out of 6 women will be raped. And if we're talking about Black and brown women, because of the intersections of oppression, it's about 1 out of 4, right? What's going on? How is it, and in straight up man talk, how is it that an epidemic of violence against women and girls is happening on our watch when we far outnumber the men who are abusive? What's that about? I think we need to figure that out. And in figuring that out, I'd love you to join us in this journey. You can check us out on all forms of social media. Our website is calltomen.org, and we're on all forms of social media. Come check us out, look us up, see what we're talking about. We're a largely Black and brown organization. And we pay very close attention to Black and brown experience. We talk about men in general, but we pay very close attention to experience of Black and brown men as well. We spend a lot of time looking at the trauma that men experience. We know that hurt people, right? So we put a lot of time and energy in exploring what's happened to us that's led us down some of the paths we've gone down. And how can we do better for ourselves, which in essence is going to do better for others that love us and care about us, that are vulnerable to us as well.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And you all have heard it here. There's an invitation that I heard. I heard a call to men, and what resonated with me is that if I'm not actively a part of the solution, then I am a part of the problem. So men, let's get on board and start looking at our role and our responsibility at what's happening on our watch. So thank you, Tony, for being here today. And we're going to drop all of the links on where everybody can get in contact with, follow, and get involved with the Call to Men in the links associated with this podcast. So thank you very much, sir, for coming in today.
Thank you for having me. It's a beautiful thing. I appreciate you.
Likewise.